have this incredibly bloated financial sector. It's a phony crisis. They don't have to be cuts. We know how to get out of a Great Depression. You spend money. If we take a look at the typical worker, they're not doing fine.
Hi, I'm Dean Baker. I'm your host for the podcast Mostly Economics. Today we have on our show Nancy Altman, who's the president of Social Security Works and someone who I could say has been working on Social Security issues even longer than I have. Nancy's work goes back many, many years, back to the Greenspan Commission in 1982, which was the last major overhaul of Social Security. So when it comes to knowing Social Security, I think very, very few people can claim greater authority than Nancy. So I'm very happy to have Nancy on the show here.
Thank you so much for having me, Dean.
Well, we have a lot to talk about today, and which is both good and bad, because you and I both feel the same. Social Security is a great program, and unfortunately, it's threatened today in perhaps a way it's never been before. But to start with, maybe we could just outline, what you see as the major features of Social Security and why it is such an important program.
Social Security is really essential for a society where people get their essentials through work, where everyone works and you need work. There's no uniform basic income or anything like that. Because what Social Security is, it's insurance against the loss of wages. As I say, as long as you need your salary or wages to pay for your housing and your food and your clothing and so forth, you need insurance against their loss. You can lose that income if you die leaving young children who are dependent on those benefits. You can lose that income if you become so disabled that you cannot support yourself through work, or if you have the good fortune to live to very old age, you lose your income if you retire. Social Security insures wages in those three categories. In addition, you can lose your wages if you become unemployed. And we don't think of unemployment insurance as Social Security, but it was part of the Social Security Act of 1935, and it's the same concept. It's insurance against the loss of wages. And Dean, if I can say one more thing, it is strikingly superior to its private sector counterparts. It's portable from job to job. It's extremely secure. Its plan sponsor is the federal government, which is not going out of business and can tax and borrow funds and so forth. So it's strikingly superior. Its one shortcoming is that its benefits are too low.
It's, again, this, of course, very well. I mean, it's just remarkable what an amazing success story Social Security has been. So, President Roosevelt, of course, starts this during the Depression. And at that time, to be elderly pretty much meant to be old. I mean, you're dependent on your family. So if your family could support you, you're okay. But a lot of families, particularly during the Depression, couldn't support their aging parents. And the poverty rates were through the roof for the elderly. And today, I haven't looked at the latest numbers, but the poverty rate for people over 65 is somewhere around 10%. It's actually a little bit lower than for the rest of the population. So that's just an amazing success story there. And as you mentioned, I think a lot of people forget that Social Security also protects people against disability. So you have, I don't know, somewhere around 10, 12 million people get disability from Social Security. And then also for children of workers that die young. And again, it's almost comical. Elon Musk was very upset that you had 4-year-olds getting Social Security. And, the rest of us were going, yeah, that's what happens when, unfortunately, they had a parent that died young. That's one of the benefits of Social Security. But, he apparently thought he'd found new evidence of fraud. So,
exactly. It just shows his ignorance of the program. And as important as Social Security is as an anti-poverty program, and it is extremely effective. In fact, when Social Security was enacted, every state but New Mexico had poorhouses, and in those poorhouses were people who normally had worked their entire lives, but in old age did not have family who could support them and literally went to the poorhouse. But the difference between that and means-tested programs is that means-tested programs are to alleviate poverty. But what insurance is, it prevents you from falling into poverty. So it really is Franklin Roosevelt his colleagues really knew what they were doing when they designed and created this program.
Yeah, no, it's an incredibly important point that, I think is often underappreciated. Well, probably not underappreciated so much as deliberately distorted. So when people talk about Social Security as an entitlement, as a benefit, it is. But the point is people paid for it. So it's just like no one would think that if I was paying for insurance and my house burned down, that somehow that was a handout. I mean, I paid for the insurance. That's
Or that you
what
were
Social
wealthy, you
Security
didn't
is.
need it, so you didn't get it, right?
Yeah. So the attacks on it are just, again, so I don't know how much it's confusion versus deliberate misrepresentation, because obviously if your intent is to cut or, destroy the program, it gets less support if you could portray it as a handout rather than, no, this is the insurance program. Workers paid into it their whole lives. And yeah, they have every right in the world to expect the benefit for it.
And that is, I think, part of the undermining of Social Security. And it's really had, I think, an impact on disability benefits. And that is somehow to make people feel they shouldn't take those benefits, that somehow there's something wrong with those programs, when actually it's deferred compensation. People don't feel funny about taking their salaries. So that's their current cash compensation. If they get a retirement through their employer, there's, you're of course you're going to get that. That's part of your compensation. And Social Security is the same thing. In fact, until a few decades ago, employers would claim Social Security as a benefit that they provided their workers because they do match the worker contribution dollar for dollar, but we don't see that anymore. But employers would be smart to take credit for it and to push to improve it.
You have one more point about Social Security, which obviously you know very well, Nancy, that the benefit structure is very progressive, and that's again quite explicit, so that it's based on your average earnings over most of your working life, your best 35 years, and for a lot of people that is their whole working life. I mean, at least the years that they've credited, and you get 90% back of your average earnings on the cutoff was it 12,000. Your first 12.
Yeah, I haven't looked at what it is for this year, but it's something like that. Yes.
Yeah, so you get 90%. Better or worse, there's a lot of people in that category. So they get 90% of the first 12,000. People work part-time, part-year. They're out of the labor force for a period of time. Disproportionately, that's women. They spend more time raising kids, so you disproportionately have women in that category. But then you get 35% on your next, and again, I'm shooting in the dark here. It's roughly 40,000. We used to know these numbers by heart.
Yeah.
I haven't looked at it lately. So you get 33% of the next, let's say 40 or 50,000. And then higher income earners, they get 15% of their income above, let's say 60,000. Again, don't take me to town on that, but it's somewhere around there. So it's a very progressive payback structure, which again, we could quarrel with where you have the cutoffs. Should it be higher? Nancy's making the point it would be good if it were higher. I'd agree with that. But you could talk about all sorts of ways to restructure that. But it's clearly a very progressive payback structure, which is one of the reasons why it keeps a lot of people. They have low earnings during their working lifetime, but even with their low earnings during their lifetime, it still gives them enough to stay out of poverty, which isn't to say it gives them enough to have great lifestyle or anything, but it is enough to keep them out of poverty.
Yeah. And it's, again, I think it fits with the insurance concept because, it's sort of behind the veil. You don't know when you're starting out in your career whether, you can speculate somebody has higher education and so forth, likely to make a high salary, but anybody can get hit by a truck and wind up with a disability where they just cannot support themselves through work. And therefore, having that progressive benefit formula is really beneficial for everyone at the start of your career. And it.
Yeah. Again, that is again a point that has to be emphasized because I've come across, I'm sure you have, many people that really don't understand that idea of insurance. They go, well, I'm a lawyer. I earn $200,000 a year, which would put you over the top, and your payback would be relatively low relative to your $200,000 a year because you're at the high end. You're getting 15% of your average pay. You go, it's a real bad deal for me. Well, maybe they're able to work their whole life as a lawyer. It ends up not being that good a payback. Well, I'm in good health. My health insurance has been a real bad deal for me.
Yeah.
So I get real angry.
My house never burned down, so there you go. And I've always had fire insurance.
Yeah. So that's the nature of it being insurance. And, as you said a moment ago, I mean, yeah, you have a good job, it turns out you earn 200,000 a year your whole working life. So it doesn't give you that good of payback, but there's no guarantee you don't get hit by a truck. You don't get real sick. We've all known people that, they're relatively young and they have something that happens to them. And even though they were on a good career track where they would have had high earnings, they don't because, they get sick or they were in an accident. And from the time they're 33, they're barely able to work, or maybe not work at all. They're going to get a better, they will get a good return on their Social Security benefits. So it's important to understand it's insurance. That's the design. We aren't making up words here. It's actually called, social insurance. Yeah.
Yes, survivors. And in fact, one of the stories I read about that really struck me and that I really like to talk about is Social Security is disproportionately beneficial to those who've been disadvantaged in the workplace. So people of color, women, LGBTQ plus community. But it's actually important for, I like to joke, wealthy white men as well, because there was a story that about a couple did very well, were retired in Florida, had millions of dollars, had a very pleasant lifestyle and so forth, but made one mistake. They happened to give all their money to invest to Bernie Madoff. And when they woke up and found out what had happened, they were destitute and they only had their Social Security. And thank God they had that Social Security because they would have been on the street. So again, it's insurance. It's there to protect you. As you and I say, a lot of kinds of insurance, I'd prefer to pay for disability insurance and never collect disability insurance, but it is there if something were to happen.
Yeah. It's also, and again, obviously Nancy knows this very well. I mean, it's incredibly efficient. You made this point how it's, superior to private plans. We've both been in this debate forever. I don't know how many times, I've gone up against the privatizers and go, oh, it's just, 1% a year if you have a 401k. Often they're considerably more than that. Often the administrative costs, they're often around 1.5 or even 2%. A lot of people have analyzed that closely. So you often have a lot of plans where they're very high administrative costs. But what's important to understand, they compare that to the administrative cost for Social Security, which is less than 0.4% of what it pays out in benefits each year. So they compare the 1.5% for their 401k to the 0.4, and they go, it's not that different. That's very misleading because let's say I put my $10,000 in 401k, they're charging me 1.5% each year. So if it's sitting in that 401k for 20 or 30 years, I've paid maybe 25, even 30% of what I'm ultimately going to get out of that. I've paid that to the company, to the financial company that's administering the 401k. So we aren't just talking about, well, even 1% for 0.4 it's more than twice as much.
Yeah.
But even that's a big difference. But it's actually much more. We're talking about saying it's more than an order of magnitude different, which, to my view, that's one of the big reasons why there's so many people interested in privatizing it, because that's waste. We got our friends at DOGE looking to get rid of waste. Well, that's some serious waste, but that waste is income for banks, for insurance companies, for businesses in the financial industry that would love to be able to get their hands on Social Security funds. So that's again, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to just agree with you. I mean, that's exactly what I think is going on right now is, as much as President Bush back in 2005 sought to privatize Social Security. And I think for just that reason, so that there could be the Wall Street could make, about $1.5 trillion flows through Social Security every year. Wall Street gets none of that. And they would like to get a big chunk of that, at least for administration and brokerage fees and so forth. But to George W. Bush's credit, he at least had a proposal that he put on the table and went around and talked about, and you and I and others could debate about it and show all the problems with it. And it didn't even get a vote in a Republican-held Congress because it was such an unpopular idea and such a bad idea. But what they're doing now is worse, which is all behind closed doors. I mean, you mentioned DOGE, Elon Musk's department supposed to be of government efficiency, but it's really creating enormous amount of waste and inefficiency and and opening the door to outright fraud.
Yeah, just to back up, and we'll come back to that in a second. I just wanted to, emphasize some of the misleading claims that really, often made, but certainly made by Elon Musk about Social Security. So one, I don't know what's in his head, so I can't say what he's convinced of, but he constantly talks about the fraud there. And, again, this is one of these things, it's more general with DOGE. Of course there's waste. Of course there's fraud in the government. It's a huge enterprise. How can you dish out $7 trillion a year and not think there's some fraud? And we do have, the General Government Accountability Office, which actually does do that. We have inspector generals at Social Security, at the other agencies that spend careers. They have professionals. They've been looking at this for years and years and years. And, in the case of Social Security, they have looked for fraud, and they know it's very rare. And you might have the data on that. But,
I do. You're exactly right. They're running around claiming all this fraud, but this is another way that Social Security is superior. There's much more fraud in private insurance. The American Academy of Actuaries have done studies about that, with very widespread fraud in a lot of private sector insurance. Social Security has been audited. It's constantly audited. It's got the Inspector General who, again, if the Trump administration were concerned about fraud, I think their first move would not have been to fire the Inspector General, whose job it is to be looking for that. But there's also been lots of outside auditors. It's a very heavily audited program. And what they found is that 99.7% of all the payments are accurate, in full, on time, to the right people. And that 0.3%, even that, most of that are payments made in error. So, for example, where information is changed, it's reported, but because Social Security is understaffed, it takes a while to get the information through the systems. And so there may be several months of overpayments, or there could be underpayments as well. They're not fraud, but they're just mistakes. And with respect to overpayments, that money is clawed back as soon as the government realizes it was a higher benefit that should have been paid. And in fact,
I could give you a very specific example of that. I know someone who was getting disability, and her situation improved, and she wrote to Social Security and said, I shouldn't be getting it. I'm able to work now. At least the disability is not preventing me from working. And she continued to get checks for 3 months, 4 months, whatever the period of time was. And then they processed them. They said, "Oh, okay, you have to get that money. Give us the money back," which she did. So they got the money back. So
exactly.
So it was
payment. It may not be a loss to the government, and there tend to be, and this is thanks to the Republicans in Congress. The administration, wrongly, I think, the Trump administration is probably different, but prior administrations were much more diligent about overpayments than underpayments.
Yeah.
And that's, to me, is shouldn't be that way. But the point is that the actual fraud, and there is, as you say, in any program this size, there are going to be attempts, and in fact, even fraud. Scam. They get your money deposited from supposed to go to your bank account. They switch the bank account or something. Usually, people discover that right away, and even though they might not catch the fraudster, they stop the fraudulent payment. So just looking at snapshots doesn't really tell the full story.
Yeah, I remember this again. I've talked about this in the past, but the Washington Post, and this is the sort of reporting that encourages people to think poorly of Social Security. They had a big front page story, jumped to 2 full pages inside, about how Social Security paid out, and I'm forgetting the exact number, something like $2 or $3 billion to dead people. And, any of us would see that, we have our nose in the numbers, but most people don't. I don't blame them. They have other things to do. They have lives. So you go, oh my God, they paid out $2 billion to dead people. And then if you actually read through the piece, it was over, I think, 5-year period. And most of it was gotten back. And the percentage of the actual payments, and again, I don't have the number at my fingertip, but it was something like 1,000th of 1% of the actual payments. Now, I've raised that to people and they go, well, it should be zero. We'd love it to be zero, but that's not the real world.
Well,
Do you want to spend 10 billion to catch 2 billion in overpayments, most of which you get back anyhow? That's anyhow, but that's the sort of thing because,
there's that.
again,
There's also, and some of this also people don't understand because Congress, in some sense, the conservatives in Congress are so concerned about fraud that they have made the program so incredibly complicated that in some cases overpayments are impossible to avoid. Let me give you just one example, and that is that your payment is the payment people get is for the month before your Social Security benefit. And to be eligible for that payment, you have to be alive every single day of that month. Now, I think that's wrong. I think if you die on the last day of the month, you should get a prorated benefit. You should get most of the benefit, but you don't. So imagine someone, or I mean, I'm sure it happens. It happens, but think of a case where someone dies on the last day of the month, and then their benefit is to be paid on the first Wednesday of the following month. Well, there might only be a day or two between those two events. And so there's going to be an overpayment because the death hasn't even been reported. That is an overpayment. Now, as the government will find out about that, 2 days later, and they'll go to the bank account and they'll scoop the money back. Or if the bank account's been closed, they'll go to the family, a grieving family, and get the money back. But that's one where I would argue there's no way it can be. That's not even an error or careless. It's just you can't get the information that quickly. So just because, and that would be a dead person getting a payment
Yep.
because they're dead.
And that undoubtedly is the bulk of the, not necessarily the last day of the month, but it's someone,
But something like that, where it's
yeah, yeah, that's the bulk of them. It was striking, and again, obviously, you're totally on top of this. Elon Musk, and who knows, again, can't speak for what's in his head, but saying 20 million, he found a file that has 20 million people over the age of 115 or something. And he's going, oh my God, all these people are getting checks. And, again, if he had talked to anyone there, they would have explained to them, this is an inactive file. None of them are getting checks. They know they're dead. And the reason why they don't clean it up is it would cost them millions of dollars to clean it up. Congress doesn't want to give them, so they have this file. It has no consequence for the program. It's not that they're getting checks. So yeah, they have a file with people who are 130 years old if they were alive, but they know they're not alive and they're not getting checks.
And in fact, I mean, one thing, I mean, that's one thing where, someone is born, gets a number, and then dies at age 10 and is never going to get a benefit. It would really be a misuse of dedicated revenue to be cleaning that up because it's immaterial that the person has a number. But even more than that, and this again shows Elon Musk's and Donald Trump's ignorance, that you can have dependence on an earnings record. So you still need that Social Security number and that earnings record even after the person has died. I mean, as I was looking at this, the last person to get a Civil War pension, it was 5 years ago in 2020. And that was because it was a disabled adult daughter of a Civil War veteran who had, the daughter had been born towards the end of his life and lived a long life. So this has been very, very heavily audited, and the program is extremely efficiently run and accurately run.
So let's talk a little bit about specifically, because obviously we know Elon Musk and DOGE have been getting into the running of Social Security in a big way. And you want to say a little bit about what the issues have been raised? And obviously, there's a lot of them.
It's really, and I have a whole theory, and we sort of were touching on it. What is going on? But the Elon Musk has been looking. As soon as after January 20th, these DOGE minions, one as young as 19, the racist who got fired and was brought back. They've been all over the Social Security Administration, and they were seeking our most sensitive files. I mean, there is so much. They're doing this in every agency, but all of we have an agreement with the government that we provide the sensitive information to them for a mission-driven purpose, and that is to, in the case of Social Security, to keep our earnings records and our families' earnings records and so forth. And then actually in the case of disability insurance, if you've even applied for disability insurance, even if you haven't gotten it, you have all your medical records that the Social Security Administration has. It's got a lot of sensitive records if somebody's in a witness protection program and has to get a new Social Security numbers, all kinds of information. No one in the history of the program has had access to all of the information. And the only ones who've had access at all, they have to have very mission specific purpose. And then they talk about it being sandboxed. So it's very securely held. It's always been looked at in a very secure way and only, and so forth. The January 20th came, and the acting commissioner, because of course the political commissioner had left, Martin O'Malley, and then Carolyn Colvin. So the acting commissioner was named by Trump, was someone who'd been there for 30 or more, over 30 years, was very, had been in very high level positions, was kind of the perfect person you'd think of as the acting, was not political and so forth. And she was very cooperative until they asked for access to everything, including the source code, so they could rewrite anything in that data. And I know her, and I'm sure she was very polite in explaining to them why they could not have that broad access, but if they could explain what they needed, she would provide it for them. And of course, what happened was the next day, she was sent an email saying she was no longer the acting commissioner. The person who was to be the acting commissioner was actually on administrative leave. He was a middle-level person at the Social Security Administration who'd been leaking information and working with DOGE, even though his bosses didn't know that he was doing that. And so he'd been put on administrative leave. He now was the new acting commissioner. He was leapfrogged over about 120 more senior people. His one qualification was that he'd give DOGE whatever they wanted. And so that's who now has all of that on top of it. And he has acknowledged that he's not calling the shots, the White House. They have hollowed out the agency. Dean, it's going to sound crazy, but it's not an exaggeration to say nearly 1,000 years of institutional knowledge has walked out the door in the last few weeks or been pushed out the door. People who'd worked there 30, 35, 40 years. And as a result, people who were the top people on cybersecurity, people who maintain the website, all of them gone, the communications people. So now, you know how SSA doesn't issue press releases anymore. It puts statements on X. That's how the public gets their information from the Social Security Administration, a for-profit platform that has advertisements. I mean, it's just outrageous. But they have decimated the agency.
If I could just back up for a moment and emphasize a couple of points here. First off, I'll start with that last one, because this has happened with a number of agencies. And I trust people know X is Elon Musk's platform. So here you have government agencies that, instead of issuing press releases that are freely available to whoever wants, I mean, to the general public, but also obviously to the media, to press, that's what they're designed for, you have to instead go to X. And how they could think that's justified, how they think that can make sense is just mind-boggling. I mean, obviously, you don't even have to argue it's a conflict of interest. What else can you call it? But, the other point, I think people have to, we're researchers, we work with this stuff. You want to look for fraud. They could give you the data. You don't need the person's name. You could, here's the information. Here's how we calculate their benefit, whatever it might be. And that's done all the time. And the Social Security Administration, the professional staff who have been there, were perfectly willing to tell Elon Musk, okay, you want to look over 1 million files, we'll give you the data, but we're not going to allow you in there. So you have that you could find information you really have no business finding out. You don't get to know their medical history. That's not your business. And you don't get to play with it. Again, we have to trust them that, I've worked 35 years, whatever period. They're not going to change that, make it 15 years.
That's right.
Assume they didn't do that, but,
There's no way to know. There's no
Yeah.
way to know. And in fact,
yeah.
I was told, I don't know if this is right or not, but I'm afraid it may be, that Social Security has always gotten a clean audit. As I say, it gets audited by outside auditors all the time. And it's always a clean audit. I'm told that it will never have another clean audit because there'll have to be an asterisk, because for just the reason you're saying, that no one knows whether something's been changed. There's no way to find out, which is just, and that's sort of almost the most trivial aspect of all this. I mean, they are doing real damage, even if they are, even if they had the most benign motives, and I don't believe that they do, but even if they did, it is a complicated system. To make changes, you really have to understand the program, because it's not just that it's COBOL and a computer language that they don't know. It's also that these people don't know the program, because you have to know what order to put things in, and it may have one change may have another change somewhere else. And they're talking about, this is another thing that's, there's so much crazy stuff going on, but they've talked about updating the whole systems within a few months. That is, the experts I talked to, that is almost certain to cause problems with cascading effects and could crash the entire system.
Yeah, one of the things, and again, they're mocked for it, but they use this language, COBOL, which goes back, I think, to the '60s. It is an ancient language. You can make fun of them for that, but there's a logic to that, and it's simply that because it has been used for so long and on such a large scale, we know there are no bugs in it.
Exactly.
And we get he calls them super high IQ. I maybe give him an IQ test. I don't know, but we get the DOGE boys in there, and maybe they are very smart. I have no idea. But when you put in a new system there, the idea it's going to run perfectly and there won't be serious bugs. I mean, it'd be great if that were true, but there are a lot of very smart people that try, working on changing the program before, and they all backed away because they realized they couldn't do it. So.
And there's no reason to update it. The concerns are there are fewer and fewer people who know COBOL, and they're expensive because there are so few of them. But it's a system that works. And I was reading about sort of this idea that, the cool kids, it's not the program the cool kids know. Well, it's, as you say, it's a program that is operated for so long, it's the bugs are gone. And if you have any kind of new system, they're going to be putting bugs in, and it's going to be cascading problems because they don't know they don't understand the program, and they're not taking the time. If you were going to do this, and they do it with little pieces of it, they have been updating the system, and you do little pieces and you test them and you have redundancies and you make sure before you turn one off and turn the other on that it's going to produce the right results. You can't do that in a few months. That takes years. And that's just that. They're also making all kinds of changes. And again, this is, I think, because of the fraud on what you can do on the phone, because they claim there's fraud where there's not fraud. And it's just creating chaos, and it's creating the opportunity for scammers to come in and prey on a population, seniors who are disproportionately or subject to scams.
Yeah, the phone issue was, they said that, and I think they backtracked on this, but people wouldn't be able to set up or change their direct deposit over the phone. And of course, almost by definition, we're talking about elderly people, we're talking about disabled people. Many of those people will have trouble working on the internet.
And there's more fraud on the internet. I mean, that's
exactly. This is what I was going to get to. Elon Musk was running around saying that 40% of the phone calls are fraudsters.
Oh, yeah.
And what the actual statistics was, 40% of the fraud is done over the phone.
Exactly.
Which is like, like totally opposite. I don't know what that's like. One in 10,
One in
100,000 phone
30,
calls.
1 in 3,100. 1 in 3,100 phone calls.
So yeah, so it just, again, you just go like, he gets this number that, obviously he wanted to say it. I'm sure Elon Musk could figure out if we sat him down and explained, oh, it's 40% of the fraud, not 40% of the phone calls. But yeah, he just totally misrepresented it. And as a result of that, he's proposing his policy that'd be an incredible inconvenience for, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people.
Millions. No, and because they were also saying that you had to come in when you're filing a claim, you really had to file it in person or over the internet. Again, in person, first of all, over the internet, especially in rural areas, there are a lot of people who don't have broadband. And the field offices could be an hour's drive away. And they're talking about closing the field offices. So it's this sort of Orwellian stuff where they say, okay, people who work in the field offices cannot work remotely. They have to go into the field offices. But by the way, we're going to close all the field offices. They've already closed regional offices. They've created chaos where the employees themselves don't know. They find out about these changes the same way the public does. And the public starts calling and they don't have answers because it hasn't been vetted. They haven't been trained. The policies haven't even really been very well thought through. And so they keep reversing them. I mean, it's really, as I say, the most benign is that they're incompetent, but unfortunately, I think they're really trying to undermine the system. So you take your pick.
It sure seems that way. Again, the abuse of the workers. Again, they talk about these people like, they're living high in the hog. We both don't make people in the Social Security Administration. You can make a comfortable living. You're not getting rich there. Most of the people could get much more money in the private sector, but they're there. They're serving the public. They understand what they're doing. And, here's Musk comes in. And he just treats them like shit. That was the policy today. It's a different policy. Oh, tomorrow it's a different one. And
it's demeaning, and it's the go get a real job, basically, even though these jobs are so hard and really not well compensated, but people do it because they believe in the mission and they believe in public service. But you're right, it's just horrible. And on top of it, they don't know from day to day what's going to happen. They're said, okay, fork in the road. Okay, there's the carrot of you can retire early or you can leave and get a lump sum payment. But the stick is, if you don't, you're probably going to be fired. And those are starting now. We're in this phase 2 where they're huge numbers. So you've got an agency that was already at a 50-year low and is now, they're talking about getting rid of about 15% more. So it's understaffed, overworked, and it's just spiraling downward. And it's really, 50-year low is actually an understatement, because what happened 50 years ago was the enactment of SSI. And so before SSI, the administration was the Social Security program. So I think it's basically probably the lowest it's ever been. Certainly,
just to be clear for people, SSI is supplemental security income, so it's an add-on. It's not part of the regular Social Security program.
Exactly.
So that is a means-tested program, and actually, for that reason, requires a lot of administrative staff that you don't need for Social Security, the disability part of Social Security and Social Security itself, because that's not means-tested. It's you have an earnings record. They don't have to go out and check your income.
And of course, again, because it's a kind of demonized program, even though it's a really important program, there are all kinds of, you have to bring your pay stubs in every month to show you what you've earned. And if your family gives you groceries, you have to report that. It's kind of, so that the supplemental security income represents about 5% of all the benefits that go out. 95% are for Social Security. Yet it's something like 40% of the administrative expenses or SSI expenses. So again, it gives you a sense of how much resources are devoted to administering that program.
Let me get to something I'm sure Isabel that you scares me to death. Bad term. The use of the Social Security death files in an immigration.
Yes.
You know more about than I do. I'm sure this one really scared me.
Yes. So, despite what the richest man in the world, Elon Musk, and at the moment the most powerful man in the world, Donald Trump, will spout about all these dead people getting benefits. I mean, I can't believe that Donald Trump on a joint session of Congress that was broadcast nationwide spent minutes talking about just lies about all these people getting benefits. Actually, because the Congress breathes down the necks of SSA to make sure that there aren't overpayments, they are extreme. This administration has always been extremely diligent in making sure that payments of people who've died terminate immediately. So it used to be funeral homes and families that reported. There was a lump sum death benefit that was put in the 1950s. The idea was to pay funeral costs, but it was also to have an incentive for people to report right away when someone, a beneficiary, had died. They spend millions of dollars. The Social Security Administration spends millions of dollars every year. All 50 states have what are called electronic death registries. So when a death is reported, it's immediately checked out, and the information is immediately transmitted to the Social Security Administration, and benefits are terminated immediately. So they're extremely quick about catching that. And actually, there's a problem where sometimes they make a mistake and someone who's alive is recorded. It could be that in the funeral home, the person's filling it out, a spouse or someone who's upset misunderstands and fills out their own name or their own Social Security number, where it's supposed to be the deceased person's or something. So a person who's living gets on, is reported as dead. And that is devastating. That it is hard to underestimate how catastrophic. I wouldn't wish that on my, worst enemy. Because what happens is not only are your benefits canceled and your Medicare, if you're getting health insurance, so you have no health insurance, but that even though that death master file, there's supposed to be caveats and so forth, they are used by banks and others, and so your banks are closed, your credit cards, your house is put up for sale. I mean, all kinds of things, and you can get in these endless loops of trying to correct it. There was a case. There's actually a class action against Social Security now because a woman was put on inadvertently, was reported as dead, and it took her months and months and months and months to correct it. And within 7 months of that having happened, she died. And her family believes that a lot of it is because of the stress and the horror. I mean, again, can you imagine? You have no health insurance, you have nothing, you can't.
Well, this is actually what I want to highlight, that Musk actually, I forget the number, I believe it was 6,000 people.
6,000, that's right. And that's may just be the beginning.
Yeah. And, say they recorded them as dead. So as they understand it, and who knows that they're accurate, but they're saying they have identified 6,000 people who aren't here legally. And again, we don't know what standard they're applying. They had them classified as dead, which means that, they can't work. They can't have a bank account. They can't use a credit card. If they own property, if they own a house, they lose it.
They lose their health insurance. They lose everything. And in fact, the thing that's so crazy about the concept, this is to get them to self-deport, is that you couldn't even do that. You can't buy a plane ticket. You can't get a visa for, if the world thinks you're dead, you cannot do any of that because it would be viewed as fraudulent. But what the fraudulence is, putting someone on the death master file when you know they're not dead. It's really cruel and horrible, and it's part of this administration, which is, I think, cruelty is part of the game.
And again, just to be clear, we don't even know. I mean, we saw how careless they've been in sending people to prison in El Salvador. They have not, these people haven't had a trial. They haven't gone through a legal process. It's just however the names came to Elon Musk or whoever's calling the shots there, on his DOGE team, they've decided these people should leave the country, and they're reporting them as dead. Now, they could be U.S. citizens for all we know, for all they know.
They could be enemies of the, they could be, they're probably not going to do it to Liz Cheney because she's too well known, but you could imagine they could do it to people they don't like, or people who've registered Democratic, or, who knows how they might. And again, you've got these young guys, they might say, hey, let's do every fifth person. I mean, how would we ever know? And
no, it's a very, very scary thing.
And for that matter, that would be the worst, putting them on the death master file. But as you said, they could wipe out your earnings record. They could say you don't have quarters of coverage. You're not eligible for the benefits you've earned. So and there is no oversight. Congress is completely silent. We don't know what these people are doing, and there are many scarier things. The idea of any of us could be picked up on the street and find ourselves in El Salvador. I mean, how, that could happen. People probably saw what that tough student who was surrounded by all these men in black and whisked away. I mean, she could have been whisked away to El Salvador, and what was she supposed to do at that point? That, of course, is much more serious, but that doesn't minimize the idea that they can just undermine, say, hey, I don't like the way you look. You're not getting Social Security, even though you've worked your whole life for it.
And that's exactly why these files had always been very tightly held by professional staff. And that's why, the Biden, they have all these crazy stories about Biden was doing this and Obama was doing that. No, none of them ever tried. And if they did try, you probably have heard about it, but if they did try, professional staff would have said no. And if they, for some reason, have persisted, I'm sure they would have contacted members of Congress who would have stepped in and said, no, you can't do that. In this case, the Republicans in Congress, and obviously they control the House and Senate, they're like, we didn't see anything. Okay, by us, whatever.
Yep. No, it's really unbelievable what's going on. And then, in fact, there's a lawsuit that has been brought by a number of the unions against against Social Security Administration, against Elon Musk, and so forth. And there have been what are called declarations. There's sort of like depositions, and there have been some whistleblowers too who have come forward. And they're really chilling reading, but it's online, so anyone can read it. But I mentioned Michelle King, the acting commissioner who'd been named by Donald Trump, but was fired when she wouldn't give them, or was replaced when she wouldn't give them access to all of this data. Her chief of staff filed what's called a declaration in great detail about all of this. And one of the things she said that really got me was that the data has always been held very securely. It's got to be seen on site in certain kinds of very controlled environments. But the DOGE people took it off site, and they were looking at an OPM. They have no idea who legitimately had access. Somebody walking by could look at it. I mean, and again, some of this is national security stuff. If someone has defected to this country and gotten a new identity, that's data you don't want loosely, others to be able to hack into it. And so the good news is there was a lawsuit, and the plaintiffs got a temporary restraining order and have just gotten a preliminary injunction. But of course, Elon Musk and Donald Trump, it's not like they're so sensitive to the rule of law and the understanding of checks and balances. And so I'm quite concerned that they're circumventing it, because a lot of the DOGE people are being embedded. What the court said was that the DOGE people could not have access to any of this information, and to the extent they already had it, they had to delete it. But it's hard to know whether they're really doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Let me just mention something. I don't usually give financial advice, but we'll give some financial advice here. People should, if you don't already have a copy of your Social Security earnings record, get one. Get a hard copy, keep it somewhere secure, make 2 copies of it, because again, we should hope that they keep your records intact. They've done that for, the program's entire existence, but that's not, unfortunately, something we can take for granted at this point.
And I 100% agree with that. And one of the things that really angers me is that the law requires that those statements be mailed to everyone age 25 and older every year. And that is the law. That is not discretionary. That is a requirement of the law. But during the George W. Bush years, the commissioner at that time, claiming they didn't have the money for it, stopped the mailing, even though there are a lot of other things. They could have stopped continuing disability reviews. There are all kinds of things they could have stopped, but they chose to stop that. And even Democratic administrations have not restored it. And that's unfortunate. But you still can get that either by going online, or you can write and get the record. And I agree. That and the other advice I would give to people is political advice, which is to call your members of Congress, your senators and your representative, and I would call them every day, and demand that there be some oversight of Elon Musk so we know what he's doing.
We should probably cut this off there, but thanks a lot for coming on. And, this is, both of us obviously think it's an incredibly important program, and, it's really crucial that we protect it and preserve it. So thanks for coming on.
And expand it. And expand.
Yeah, we'll come to that in the next show. Let's hope we have a time to seriously talk about expanding it.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you like what you just saw, please help us out by liking us and subscribing. Thank you.